All right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Can I ask you to take a seat? And we are starting with the last part of the first day of this conference, which is, of course, the dinner. But before we have the culinary delights, we'll have another intellectual delight, for sure. And this is going to be the dinner speech by Governor Stefan Ingves. And let me just introduce him a little bit. And I was given an extremely long list of things that he's done. So I will be selective, if I may, because otherwise we may be sitting here quite a long time. So let me give you some highlights. So Stefan was a governor of the Swedish Central Bank, Sveriges Riksbank, and chairman of the executive board from 2006 to 2022. He was also in 2019 the first vice chair of the ESRB, and he was for many years, actually 2011 to 17, chairman of the ATC, the Advisory Technical Committee of the ESRB. So he is clearly the right person to give the dinner speech today on macroprudential policy, and we're really very, very pleased and very honored that you found the time to come here. He also did a few other things before that. So he was a director of the Monetary and Financial Systems Department. I think it's now called MCM, I guess that's the predecessor, no? At the International Monetary Fund. He was deputy governor at the Sveriges Riksbank. This was in the 90s when things were rather turbulent, also in Sweden, if I remember correctly. And he was also head of the Financial Markets Department of the Swedish Ministry of Finance. This was in the late 80s and early 90s. And as I said, this is highly selective, but I think I probably illustrated already that he is really the perfect man to give this dinner speech. And again, thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours, Mr. Ingves.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and also on my side, a heartfelt thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and say a few words in front of such a distinguished and knowledgeable crowd when it comes to what is called nowadays called macroprudential. The issue with dinner speeches is that it's hard. And that's because there is no free lunch. That's what economists are taught. But there's no free dinner either, so you're going to have to listen to me. And so anyway, a few words on macroprudential and issues surrounding that. I mean, something similar to macroprudential has actually been around longer than that, and particularly in some emerging markets. And quite a number of years ago now, I sat down with a governor, and many governors have been there since then, in a country where presently the policy rate today was raised to 30%. And we talked about LTVs. And he said, well, you know, here my preference is an LTV, a loan-to-value ratio of 40%, because I don't like when people borrow money. They can borrow from grandma and grandpa. I don't want to have a problem in my system. So in some countries, this was done quite early. That also actually holds from a number of countries in Eastern Europe. And we have heard about one version of that today. And as was said here already, I have been involved in this from day one. And I have truly enjoyed that, because I have tried to be a kind of a public sector entrepreneur when it comes to building things within the public sector. And in the early days, I had the privilege of, together with the Secretariat, more or less create the ESRB, because when I started out doing this, there was absolutely nothing there. And we put in place all the procedures and all the ways of doing things. And I've had the privilege of doing that for many years. But of course, also when I'm talking about these issues, it's also colored by my 17 years at the Riksbank, being chairman of the Basel Committee, and also at the IMF. So where are we, and where do we come from? As has been made clear by others earlier today, in the old days, if I call it that, macroprudential analysis, the way we think about it, wasn't really practiced the way we talk about it today. It's also clear from the IMF side that supervision wasn't really what it ought to be in many countries, and most of it was in a highly technical focus on individual institutions. And all of this changed after the global financial crisis because things blew up on a grand scale, and many countries ended up in difficulties in one form or another. In Europe, this started changing in 2009 because then the Jacques de la Rosière group provided an outline for setting up the ESRB, but it also included EBA, IOPA, ESMA, and basically the institutional structure that we're living with today. The idea was actually from the beginning for me to be a member of the de la Rosière group. But given what was going on in the world at that moment in time, there was total confusion who was supposed to be a member of the group. So my deputy governor ended up being a member of the group. But that didn't really matter when it comes to the outcome. And you can also see this when it comes to what happened, let's say in the UK, what has happened in the US, that many countries have struggled with similar issues, thinking hard about what to do and how to set up these structures. And I do think that was helpful when COVID-19 struck. It's important to keep in mind that the COVID episode wasn't really a financial crisis. So one way of thinking about that episode was to do things on the financial sector side in such a way that it doesn't turn into a financial crisis either. And I think that in many countries, and that holds for certain in Europe, the whole exercise was successful in the sense that it was possible to get out of this difficult period without serious trouble in the financial sector. Because it would have been incredibly difficult to deal with financial sector problems at the same time as you have a whole host of other issues during the pandemic to deal with. But that doesn't mean that things are perfect, and they probably never will be perfect. So let me list a few of them that all of you have to live with going forward. One key element, which is kind of outside macroprudential, but it is worth mentioning, is basically to make sure that the Basel III Accord is implemented timely and in a consistent manner. And speaking for myself, it's shameful that it takes till 2032 or something like that to get this thing done when the work actually started, let's say, 2009, 2010. And on the side of the private sector, there is always quite a lot of work and money putting into trying to dilute whatever has been put in place. And that, of course, means that if it takes till 2032 to put it in place, the generation of that day will ask, where did this come from? Why do we have this? Can't we start diluting now? Because then we can lend some more. Another part of it, which has been mentioned by the others also today, is how to deal with the non-bank financial intermediaries. And there are two parts to it. One is how to think about them separately from the banking sector, but the other part is really to decide whether some of these institutions are actually banks. And if you conclude that there are banks, then they actually should get a banking license. Part of this is also all sorts of cross-border aspects. One issue which is going to be high on the agenda, and it just says something about how difficult it is to look in, to see in the crystal ball where the world is heading. Thomas is sitting over there, and he was in charge of and dealt with a very difficult process on the ESRB side, writing complicated paper with the heading low for long. And then the heading was changed to low for even longer. It wouldn't surprise me if you have a conference like this 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you'll discuss papers with a heading high for long or high for even longer. We will see what the future will bring. Another difficult topic is digitalization and what that really means, because that takes all of us into a completely different field when it comes to how you think about these things. And who knows what artificial intelligence will do. And that will again, as we have seen with the SPV crisis earlier this year, affect maybe how we should think about deposit runs. Another issue which is high on the European agenda presently is to try to finesse and improve the resolution frameworks that we have. Whether that is really an ESRB issue or not, we can argue back and forth about that, but I had just recently read, I think it's 150, 200 pages with legalese dealing with resolution. And I wonder, because it's getting so technical, whether it will actually be possible to use that framework at the end of the day when things get difficult. And also, we need to understand and accept the fact that what we think is systemically important in good times can change completely in bad times. And also, if you really mismanage a small bank in bad times, there is a signaling effect in that. So in bad times, it's very, very difficult to fully understand ex ante what is systemic or not. And that is quite a challenge. But going back to the ESRB, since I was participating in this process from the early days, it's absolutely clear that in the early days, people were scratching their heads, thinking that, with more than 100 people in the room, and this happened, by the way, when we were in the old ECB building, the room wasn't really big enough. So there had to be an overflow room with other people watching what was going on. I'm pretty sure that many had their doubts whether it would be possible to turn this into something operational or not. But actually, it proved to be possible to do that. And that was quite, I think, an achievement in itself. And if you look back at what the ESRB has done over the past 10 years, a little bit more than that, there has been a rich supply of reports, consultation responses, occasional papers, and outputs of various kinds. And there is also a long list of so-called ESRB warnings and recommendations. Now, it's only if you are a lawyer that you can understand that a recommendation is more serious than a warning. This has created enormous confusion at the national level. What is this? And particularly if you issue a warning is so secret, so it's put in double black envelopes and sent to the finance ministry and the central bank in the country or to the institution in question. So it's highly unlikely that people have ever heard of a warning, of a recommendation when it actually happens, because the procedures are so complicated. But it still has worked. And what really surprised me in the early days, and I'm actually proud to have been part of that process, was that there was quite a lot of pushback when we started talking about warnings addressed to individual countries. And there were always intellectual individuals who showed up and said that the ESRB should only deal with pan-European issues. Most pan-European issues are not tangible at all. So I think it was kind of a diversion, making sure that the ESRB did nothing. And it was a good thing that eventually we got our act together and started issuing warnings to individual countries. And that was quite an achievement. And I think that what ultimately solved the problem compared to many other international bodies is that on the ESRB side you vote. And that means that when you do the work, eventually you get to a point when you say, okay, enough is enough. Now, do we have a majority for doing this or that? And then you take a vote and you get on with it. And that's a unique feature when it comes to international work, and it has been quite helpful. Now, moving from the European level to the national level, and others have mentioned this already today, you need to have a mandate. Ideally, you need to have a clear mandate, and you need to have objectives, and you need to decide and do things in a transparent way. But in order to do that, you also need to have the capacity and the professional capacity to base things on something, because otherwise your decisions are kind of taken out of thin air, and that's a bad thing. In addition to that, you need independence in one form or the other. And I do think that that is more important than many, many people realize, because basically macroprudential or microprudential is about saying no. It's not harder than that. And you are supposed to say no today in order to avoid a problem tomorrow. And that's what we human beings find most difficult to deal with. And that's why you need to have a mandate and you need to have the right to say no. But you can't do that, and you shouldn't do that in a vacuum. So at the same time, you need to understand what is going on the fiscal side, you need to understand what is going on the monetary side, and you need to understand what is going on the microprudential side. So the hard part is really to have a certain degree of independence, but at the same time position what you do in this universe in such a way that you can relate to others, and also, of course, explain what you are doing and why you are doing what you do. And you can look at the map in Europe and you can see that most countries have struggled with this, and you have ended up with many different solutions in terms of where to locate macroprudential. But my personal view is very, very clear. All of this belongs to the central bank, because central banks have more independence than others. And I think that the Swedish example is a bad one, because in the Swedish case, it ended up with FSA. That's probably manageable, not a major issue there, but the finance minister has a veto. And I think that that's a very difficult way of dealing with things, because I used to be the Sir Humphrey in the finance ministry a long time ago. And I know what ministers look like when you tell them to say no. Because if you're a politician, you are trained to say yes, because you want to make people happy. But to run a country and to make things operational when you are on the government side, a good chunk of what you are actually doing in the long run is to say no to all sorts of things. And this is very, very clear when we are talking about borrower-based tools, being it amortization requirements or loan-to-value ratios, loan-to-income, and all those things, because it's so easy to just say, let's do away with the whole thing, let people borrow as much as they like, and everybody is happy ever after. And that's not a good way to go about. At the same time, it's probably good if we have at least harmonized definitions within Europe. I'm not saying the credit cycle is not the same in different parts of Europe, and it will take some time before the credit cycle will be the same everywhere, if ever. But it still is very, very helpful if we have a common framework within which we do things, so that we can talk to each other and understand what is happening when we do things. And here I do think that all the various authorities at the European level can play quite an important role. Now, can we learn something from the monetary policy side? Well, there we have a formal machinery. So in that sense, it's much clearer what we mean when we talk about central bank independence. I don't know today how much of that can be sort of used when it comes to thinking about macroprudential issues. But at least there is a sort of a framework that has been in place much longer, and that makes it so it's worthwhile keeping an eye on what happens on the monetary side. But at the same time, it will be hard, given the complexity of the political economy of these things, to sort of copy what happens on the monetary side one to one. But at the same time, I do think that independence is important here. At the same time, as I said, independence doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that was very clear when we went through the COVID-19 episode, because then all of a sudden, out of the blue, it became important to position macroprudential, both relating to what happens on the fiscal side and on the monetary side, and of course what happens with COVID-19 as such, So you need to understand what is going on in the rest of the world. Otherwise, nothing of this will work. At the same time, when we do this in a European context, I do think that cross-border issues are important, and we need to keep an eye on them. In the early days of the ESRB, we endlessly talked about reciprocity, and I think that that conversation needs to stay. But I do think that we failed, and I can say this with hindsight, when we talked about reciprocity, because it took forever and it became so complicated, so most people cannot understand what it is and how it is supposed to work. So I do think that on that side we can do a little bit better. So then, in summary, I think that today, what we call macroprudential, regardless of what it actually contains in different jurisdictions, is much better understood and more widely understood than, let's say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I do think that in the European context, it has been important that it just so happened that you have majority decisions through voting on the ESRB side, because that makes it easier to actually push the agenda. And I do think that it was important that the ESRB fairly early moved into peer pressure and also country-based warnings and recommendations, because without that, many things that the ESRB has been doing would have been in some sense, way too soft. I also think that the ESRB ended up being an important sounding board, and I did not see it this way at all in the early days when it comes to rules and regulations in the European context, because there are numerous issues where the ESRB has opined on directives and other projects that have been going on the side of the Commission. And here I think that the soft powers of the ESRB have been important, because you can go and listen with the ESRB and you have sort of the formal right to ignore them. But given that everybody is at the table, it still matters what the ESRB says. And I think that has been proved to be quite helpful. At the same time, given that the financial sector constantly evolves, that does not mean that things stop. So we truly need to keep an eye on what is happening within the financial sector in Europe, also what happens at the global level. We need to better understand what happens when it comes to technological change and what it means when we move money around. What has surprised me in a very positive sense is that the ESRB is one of the very few institutions with the right to ask for data and ask for more data. It usually takes quite a while to collect the numbers, but it's a unique feature of the rights of the ESRB, and that means that at least it's possible to slowly over time build data sets that can be used by many. At the same time, also at the pan-European level, it's important to keep developing these methodologies when it comes to how you do these things, so that the tools that the ESRB can develop are at the disposal of everybody. And eventually, it's not quite time for me to start feeding the pigeons yet, but eventually that they will come, and then I will watch what you are doing from a distance. And my advice is just keep talking and keep talking forever, and things will turn out right. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the speech.
Thank you.
I think it would be a big waste if you start feeding the pigeon, to be honest. I think there's a lot you can tell to everybody. I don't want to keep you longer, but maybe if there is a question, now is the time to ask. Okay, everybody's hungry. I kind of expected that. That's also fine. Then one final announcement. So tomorrow morning we restart at 9:30. Very civilized time, I would say, not too early, with the SWEF annual lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Thorsten. Thank you very much, and on that, the buffet is open. Enjoy the dinner, and thank you.